Welcome back to the Integral Stages Salon of the Band, which is not just for people who've actually been canceled and excommunicated, but also for those who've occupied situations where they might appear as provocateurs or been dismissed or chastised or somehow pricked to the conscience, rightly or wrongly, of supposedly meta-level and integrative communities. We think these are important acupuncture points to investigate, and joining me today is Roman Angerer. This angerer has angered some people, or at least made them go intellectually grrr, with an overtly provocatively titled article, Hanzi Freinacht, Misleading Humanity, Bully of Consciousness, and the Pre-Traditionalism of Hanzi's Meta-Modernism. And I've got to say, I've seldom seen such an immediate flurry of smart people pointing to a text and describing it, at least initially, as irrelevant, obnoxious, pointless, and stupid, but at the same time trying to say, well, this is a serious author still. And so that's the exact kind of peculiar thing that we've convened this series to inspect. So hi, Roman. Nice to be here with you.
Nice to be here too with you, Layman. What a honor.
Okay, let me summarize your argument, and then you tell me if it sounds roughly correct. Seems to me like you're saying that, or you're exploring your feeling that the meta-modernist philosopher character Hanzi, and perhaps other meta-modernists, are articulating themselves in ways that are structurally more simplistic than the formal complexity of sentence structures in the great postmodernist philosophers like Foucault. And that this discrepancy indicates that these people might not be a real meta-modern alternative, that they might not, in other words, be embodying an authentically postmodern perspective, and that therefore their summaries and reductive dismissals and claims to be obviously already beyond postmodernism amounts to something like a bullying procedure. Is that about right?
Yeah, I would say that's the basic. What do I say? Do I have to say something more? Should I add something to what?
No, only if something comes up for you. I was hoping it would be pretty good.
We're hoping.
Maybe you could give us a sense of what your assessment procedure was. There's a lot of talk about firstness and secondness and thirdness. And what is it when you look at these sentences? What is it you're looking at?
Yeah, basically, one looks at the pieces, sentences puzzled out of into some coherent, meaningful thing. And when we start with early childhood, we might have a kid with age 2 or 18 months that can say a single word, a so-called monoreme, like daddy, mommy, dog, or use some onomatopoetic sounds like bow wow or whatever to refer to something that seems to be outside of them, or basically is one with their central perception. Using Peircean terminology, this is some sort of firstness, because it's a single abstraction that is put over a phenomena within the exterior. And then when you grow up, it seems that a sort of self, paleo-symbolic being, as Washburn says, steps out of the sensory realm and puts a secondness towards firstness. So it recognizes itself distinct from the central perception, and therefore some sort of resistance comes in, or someone who is making up dreams about reality and how the sensory perceptions that one interiorizes could change according to one's personal impulses and wishes and whatever then the culture puts into you. And therefore you have a first and a second. And this then supposedly, or from my perspective, shows up in the sentence structure of each person there as well. And it's basically pointed towards by Schumpeter and Verbal Inhaler, when they say that the formal operational stage ends with an equilibration. You become able to equilibrate your interior and an exterior into a coherent sentence or a coherent hypothesis about what reality is. And therefore, you have unified firstness and secondness and become a new self, the dreamer within the concrete world, making up ideas about the future, ideas about the zeitgeist and how to bring it into the sensory world. Then, from a Peircean point of view, you need a third. The third means that interpretation comes in, that someone becomes aware that there is an action and a reaction, that there is a sensory input, and at the same time an agency that's making up something that's different towards the sensory input, so that change can happen. Or in Aristotelian terms, you could say that a soul arises, a soul that sees that there is a sensory realm that's a complete potentiality, the matter part of what we are. And at the same time, there is a form aspect, the actualization of pure possibility into form. And therefore, you become a third or become a soul. And as Passages points out, when you move into this more major and adult realm of development, you step out of equilibration and become dialectical. Dialectical again means that things become Trinitarian, or that you use an observer or an ideology that then points towards how your dream reality and sensory perception have to align, or in some extreme cases, that the dreamer, as much as reality is only an illusion, the only thing that's real is the third, your witness self or your transcendent higher self, whatever, when you think of the Upanishads. And this too means that people, when they express themselves and want to express themselves fully, they have to use three subclauses within one sentence. One that is pointing towards their ideology or towards their new self, the witness, or the mental sphere, as much as the dream about reality and the reality itself that is perceived or changed. And thus, by looking how a clause is structured, whether it's made up of one part or two parts or three parts, allows, from my perspective, and not only from mine, to assign a stage judgment. And that's the basic idea behind it. The second aspect to it is the idea of Piaget and Inhilder, that its development is not a simple combination of two similar complex tasks into a new order of complexity, but that you add a certain function with each stage. First, you only have identity, then you become able to look at identity and negate it. So you have an identical transformation, your perception of reality, and a negative transformation that allows you to, like the second does, to change whatever you perceive. And then when you move into concrete operations and become able to compare, to see that a substance does not change when you put it in a different or in a similar glass or whatever, so that volume stays the same and there is some conservation of things. Then you need a third that can see that there's identity, there's negation, but which can reconvert the negation into the identity, which they call is a reciprocal transformation. And so you have three parts within yourself. And finally, they suggest that there is a correlative or equilibrative transformation. So force function, which then allows to see reciprocation, negation, and identity, and fuse them into a whole new identity and structure of a whole, which is basically the outcome of the formal operational thinking, that you have an identity, a prophetic self within the dreamscape that then is aligning themselves with the sensory world or the zeitgeist that it's coming in. And the same thing then supposedly happens for me when the mental sphere starts. And that's, of course, no new idea. Kurt Fischer has pointed towards a similar structure as much as Terry O'Fallon. And so when you have sentences that are built up out of three parts, you still can look whether you have one sentence with three parts, so only an identity, or whether you can align two sentences with three parts, that you have both identity and a negative transformation, as much as you can look at Piaget's early works, for example, The Origin of Intelligence in Children, and then see that he uses three triadic sentences within one clause, which means there is a new form of concrete operations. However, not comparing volume of certain containers with each other, but now being able to compare the volumes of certain types of consciousness with each other, which means that you have one triadic clause that is comparative, one triadic clause that's the identity of one consciousness, and one that's the identity of a different type of consciousness. And then the third type of triadic sentence can show how both cohere or differ. So what Kant calls the disjunctive operation. You can see that two things are different and compare them and say that even so they are distinct, there is some necessary structure behind them that makes them part of a larger whole.
Terrific.
And that's the basic idea.
So this little article of yours using this analytical method provoked a little flurry of responses for people. Did you expect it to be provocative, or did that surprise you?
I was surprised about the amount of responses. I thought it would not catch so much attention. And
did you think people were mostly responding to the style and tone, the way you expressed yourself, or to the conclusion, or to the very idea of doing sentence analysis?
I guess it's difficult to distinguish these things. So I think most people are triggered because they are familiarized with Hanzi's work and with his stage judgments and so on. And therefore they will have an initial difficulty to take in another perspective. And this, of course, implies to negate certain possibilities of measuring stage development within a way that does not put their hero on the later stage, or at least towards a realm which they could look up for, or which resembles whatever the person saw before. Of course, that's not something that I would call evil-spirited or so, but I guess it's just a normal human thing, and something that's happened to me all the time as well. Like when I looked at Descartes, my early assessment of Descartes was that he was very close to Hanzi's work. So I did not really intend to show that Descartes is further away from them. So my initial hypothesis was, okay, they might be approximately show the same level of complexity. And therefore, okay, Hanzi is not really pre-modern. But then when I looked at it, I was shocked how it came out to be. And we all have these kind of preconceptions where people land within a stage trajectory. But then when we apply some sort of objective means, even if it's a wrong objective means, which of course can be discussed, you step away from your personally being triggered and apply something that's comparable and deliver same outcomes with any person. And then one might shock oneself. But so I guess it's on the one hand this, and on the other hand, it's difficult to believe that it's so simple, or it shows up like it's very simple on the surface, and I construct it in a very simple way. And I guess that might create resistance as well to think that things are that easy to measure and compare.
I've heard some people say that sentence analysis might be good for determining traits or types of people if we're looking for Alzheimer's or a sociopath or something like that. Is there any substantial evidence that this theory of sentence complexity corresponds to real developmental phases of understanding in people?
I guess that the basically the foundation of any developmental model, as far as I'm aware, and any developmental model includes some sort of complexity measure.
Yeah.
And therefore, if not all developmentalists are wrong, there should be a correlation. But the thing is, as I put up in the beginning towards Piaget, you have to have a certain altitude, and that's part of basically any model that has multiple stages, that there's a certain stage which you reach and then you are aware of development. Even so, I think that's overly simplified. But at a certain point, you might become able to really compare consciousness with consciousness, because you have the ability to use three triadic sentences. And by this includes three spaces within your own awareness, or use coordinate three brain areas or whatever the underlying structure within in the physiology is, and then it can become apparent, not to everyone, because Foucault, of course, used a similar sentence structure that he or she used, but not ended up with the idea of stages. But when you become able to compare, you can see that sentence structure enables measuring stages of consciousness. And when I think about how the model arose, it basically arose from looking how my own awareness resonated with certain forms of textuality and certain forms of behavior within people. And then from seeing that my own consciousness changes based on the grammar people use, and to, of course, based on content and so on, but much more on the type of grammar they use. I would argue that every person could, if he or she or they are willing to engage in the experiment, read through different types of texts and be aware of how their awareness shifts in relation to different sorts of grammars, and from their own at least test the idea that grammar correlates with stage development, or at least with different types of consciousness, which of course is included in the sociopathy or Alzheimer's idea as well. Okay.
I think everybody can probably agree that in order to make certain kinds of sophisticated sentence structures, that you need to be able to make those. And so you need to be able to see and handle and integrate structures that are complex enough to make those sentences. But there also seems to be a lot of people who are concerned about how narrow a domain articulation might be. I've seen some people saying, well, isn't the ability to language a kind of a narrow skill like gymnastics, and doesn't represent the general capacity of the person? How general and how specific is the ability to convert complexity into speech?
My hypothesis, at least, is that it's something that's happening very automatic, so that our brain areas like the Broca and so on, and Wernicke areas and others are basically having some sort of selective principle. They just reimagine how the neuronal circuits are connected, and how they create a certain mind moment if you apply the upper left to it. And since they do it without yourself having to put in conscious effort, I would say that's an automatic process. When your internal structure of how your brain circuits are connected changes, the way the brain areas read out the connections change immediately as well, and therefore produce new types of grammars. And therefore it's just something very natural. And I don't think that it measures everything. Like it cannot tell you where a gymnast is, because it's a movement, but you can tell how the gymnast reflects about their ability to do gymnastics. And then maybe from there on, you could proceed to a point where you would be able to tell a person's developmental level from the way they do gymnastics, because you aligned it with a measure from a different domain. That of course is the whole thing with science, needs the ability to compare, and then you have to have something that's domain independent, or that seems to be more universal, and to which you can compare different skills and capacities. And for me, this is language. This doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best way or the only way to measure consciousness, because, as I said before, for me, the whole thing started as an internal measure or a grading system that's much more based on how my own awareness fluctuates and how certain emotions and energetic signatures show up in my body as a response towards communication. And from there on, I could crystallize that certain reactions within my consciousness, within my body, within my brain, and so on, seem to correlate with certain grammatical structures. And with time that became then more precise. And of course, this is nothing completely absolute, because when it's automatic, you move in the stage and you can easily produce complex sentences about each domain you want to reflect on. However, when it comes towards writing a book, you will not easily write a book about something like quantum physics if you have never spent time with quantum physics, but you might be able to produce one very complex sentence about it. And two, so I don't want to negate the idea that there is a developmental stage, because many people, from the idea that there are domains and skills and lines or whatever you want to call it, proceed towards the conclusion that there are no real or fixed stages of consciousness. That's not what I want to lead towards, because I think even if you don't bring up the complexity of a quantum physicist to it, you still reflect from a certain point of awareness and within a certain structure of your neuronal functioning or your epigenetic activation and your consciousness. And therefore, everything you think or say and how you reflect on it will be shaped by a very certain aspect of being aware towards the world, either from firstness or from secondness, where you not only have one word, but you equilibrate two different opinions or two different systems, or from something which has a more dialectical sense to it, because it has a third that can integrate or compare both sides of an equilibration. And that, of course, shapes how you enact each domain. And therefore, there is, on the one hand, there is, for me, for sure, something like a stage and a new awareness, but at the same time, whatever you put out is very dynamic and not necessarily restricted towards your highest capacity to be aware of the world and how you could structure everything. But that's more something that's lagging behind, and you have to fill yourself within one domain so that you become whatever you want to call it, whole. Or
so we've got a sort of background capacity to be able to take a certain complexity of perspectives into account, and that informs a kind of automatic function in terms of sentence construction, which can vary because we could say things that are simpler than that. But if you sample across an entire book or look at a lot of sentences, you'll start to get a feeling for the range that person is using. I'm curious how you feel about the notion that extra work is required to simplify, right? So one of the things Daniel Gort said was complex sentences might be an indication of a transition between two regimes of processing, whereby a lot of things are now being taken into account, but they haven't been recompressed into something simple. And that's a little bit like the argument that a poet is a more complex speaker, because in addition to being in command of a lot of perspectives, they've compacted it down into something that sounds very archaic, very universal, very simplistic. So what do you make of the argument that there's an extra level of complexity implied in deliberately simplifying?
So I guess the thing with stage transitions, of course, is something that shows up for me as well. Like when you transform, when you take Commons model, you have to both hold your own perspective and you have to negate it, and you have to create some sort of compound. So you have to combine perspectives, and then it might start to complexify in a degree that then gets lost again. And it seems that really each first quarter of a stage is a little bit simpler than the fourth quarter of the earlier stage. So there seems to be some sort of meta-awareness or mindfulness that then comes into play and might reduce the complexity. Like when you look at Foucault, so it's something anyone can do, and you look at the archaeology of knowledge, which is kind of, there are sentences that burst over from complexity and are put together through semicolons and whatever, and then you move towards the will to knowledge. We will see that the will to knowledge on the surface is much simpler. However, you will to find the same triadic sentence structure, but the person came out of this kind of crisis, discovering the new world, and then is structuring it again in a more cohesive or in a more objectified and targeted way. And that's of course something that on the one hand happens automatically when you manage to move through the crisis and come up with a new stage and a new ability to be aware and structure whatever's showing up. And then it's to some sort of art that you become able to simplify things, like simplifying a developmental measure to a level that even a formal thinker can understand it, because you only calculate the number of sentences within a sentence where the argument then suddenly is no longer true because it's so simple it must be bullshit. So just for the internal contradiction in their argument. On the other hand, it brings a lot of problems, like when you write about a stage like Hanzi Freinacht does, but you don't show the necessary grammar of 3 times 3 parted sentences. You don't show the ability to really compare consciousness to consciousness. So you're not speaking about the structure of consciousness by definition, because your sentence does not include it, but you are showing the ability to be aware of a formal equilibration. So you're basically comparing a dream state with a sensory perception. So your subjective imagination with something that might show up outside through your awareness or ideology. And then the whole thing of stage is reduced towards an ideological thing and not the comparison of 2 types of consciousness, which is by definition what a stage theory should do, namely compare internal structures of consciousness and not a dream state, pure subjectivity with correlation within the sensory realm. And that's what makes it ideological. And if you write a book and don't include any signifier towards being able to really see a stage, in my opinion, then the whole thing loses its value, because no one can prove or misprove that you're really able to see stages when you claim, I intentionally reduce myself towards a level where stages, in the sense they are defined with an integral theory, don't exist. And that for me lacks any logic. If you really are aware of stages, you should be aware that you can express certain contents only at the stage where they arise for the first time, and not at any earlier stage. But you can repeat things at an earlier stage that have once shown up at a later stage. And that's a point Hanzi, of course, points to in his book, with the difference between symbol stage and complexity stage. But on the other hand, he seems, when he says he's aware of stage development, he completely seems to ignore the fact that you somehow have to show that you're aware. And when you are aware of stages, you want to tell people something about stages, about real stages, and then you have necessarily to use these sorts of grammars and to, in the sense of creating resonance. Because if people can't listen to this certain structure of consciousness, then they cannot move into resonance and they cannot be lifted up towards a new type of thinking about the world. So, but they would be graded down or have to resonate with an earlier type of consciousness. And that's where the whole problem comes in. If you misrepresent history in this way, you create, from my point of view, from some more point of view, you create a fracture from the universal trajectory towards a completely contingent or arbitrary trajectory. And this, on the long run, can have significant implications for how humanity develops. And the problem is that, of course, hardly anyone has the skills and the time to really prove or misprove a model or prove or misprove other developmental models. So it mostly comes down to belief and mostly comes down to certain sorts of sympathy. And then it's getting problematic. And there I thought one has to engage in discourse and show that there are at least alternative possibilities to interpret how humanity developed and where modernity really starts and postmodernity, and how they are similar or different from Meta-Modernism.
Yeah, I appreciate your concern for the danger of the wrong things getting conflated as if they were higher stage-like developments. One of the things that I've seen come up in integral discussion spaces many times is when somebody says that they have attained a very high stage, or that they're operating from some even other state, some transrational experience, and they're communicating in a way that seems extremely primitive. They're just making dogmatic assertions about that fact. And it's very disturbing to the people who are receiving that signal. And that person feels like that their experience, their inner shift is being invalidated. And it's very hard to say to them, no, it's what we're complaining about is the low level of discussion and description around that. But for them, they've sort of merged the two. They're making an argument that even though they're speaking at a very low level, they've actually had very high experience and very high development. And it's possible, on the one hand, that their ability to language simply hasn't caught up yet to where they can see. But it's also very dangerous, because if a lot of people are doing this, then the idea that there is anything higher developmentally gets subsumed within something that's lower. And you get a lot of, the signal gets lost in the noise in terms of the whole community, because nobody's sure what anybody else means when they're not speaking in a way that adequately embodies the thing they're putatively describing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main problems, and it's of course a problem with stage descriptions as well. If you write a stage description, that someone like you write a stage description about turquoise or whatever stage in a way that's comprehensible by a 12-year-old. Each 12-year-old, by understanding whatever you write, will assume that they have transcended each earlier stage and are now turquoise. So the whole value of the stage description gets lost. In the same way, it loses its transformative power, which seems to be one main argument within the integral community, that stage descriptions are biopsychoactive or what else. But this can, of course, only be true if they really incorporate something that's really coming from the later stage they assume to describe. And if it's not distinguishable from any earlier writing, then it's difficult to acknowledge something later in there. Some people would say it's arbitrary to argue in a way that there has to show up some complexity, and then it's
one of the I think one of the vivid little pieces in your article is when you describe Hanzi as being, or at least through his writings, being pre-Platonic. Maybe you could say a little bit about what you mean by pre-Platonic.
Yeah, pre-Platonic. Pre-Platonic is, in this sense, is only based on the developmental stage, because given the writing, Plato was later, and Hanzi in his book points towards Plato being at the single abstraction stage, which approximately correlates with a 10-year-old in today's society, someone who can say it's so nice to play with my friends because we can exchange cards and look at which cards other people have and things like that. So where you have one idea that's comparing how it is to exchange certain things, and you start to compare yourself with others based on whatever concrete things you have, because you can use concrete operations and so on. And if you look at Plato, you will hardly see any sentences that only include a single abstraction, like something is fun or whatever. But Plato himself, even in his earliest work, reflects about how the soul is correlated to the sensory realm. So he has these aspects of firstness and secondness, the sensory realm and the trima, the soul, and how the soul is related to a third, the reasoning. So even in this sentence, you already have like 3 abstractions in one of Plato's earliest books. So it's if you really have read comments and compare an abstract sentence with Plato, you should obviously see that Plato could not possibly be someone at the single abstraction stage. And on the other hand, what kind of shocks me, but maybe I haven't written the books good enough or deep enough, that Hanzi seemingly misses the complete ideals of Plato. Like even his early books, the Charmanides or so on, deal with listening, how you listen to other persons to heal their soul and really take them in, and how people then start to flourish and become good instead of evil, and how you move out of relativity through discovering your own principles of good and evil and become insightful about your own insights, aware of your own awareness, and then finally connected to the idea of the good, to some overarching sense of perfection that nourishes how you make your distinctions about good and evil and how you judge the world, which of course is completely identical with the definition of single principles offered by Kurt Fischer, that you have a sort of universal single principle that then is orchestrating how you make opinions at your abstract system stage. So you can immediately see how Plato offers implicit descriptions of these stages within his text. And then when you look at Plato's later works, where he becomes critical and moves out of the idea of the good, this kind of mystic literal or second naivety, as one might call it, where you take in again mystical perspectives to enrich your rational mind, he starts to explain the art of birthing, the Hypomencuds or Meoitics, where he writes, I'm not very capable of offering new ideas. I'm not very creative, but I'm gifted as a listener. I'm listening to peoples inspired by God in a way that they by themselves, if they self are able and if God supports them, can change their paradigms and come up with completely new ideas and live as better and more complete and sociable beings, which of course is the idea of listening. So why do you write a book about listening if you ignore the historical roots of listening and denigrate someone just because he has lived 2,500 years ago, but offers very similar and very compelling ideas about the same art you're trying to compose? And that's to something that might be pre-Platonic, or where these boundaries of past and present and the existence of each moment of time within now and each other moment of time might be more cherished and unified, instead of putting forced boundaries between stages or between historical periods. And I think that's one sense of the word pre-Platonic.
Very similar to what you're saying about Foucault in a way, is that in both cases with Foucault and Plato, the Hanzi writing is underappreciating the level of complexity in the author and proposing that it's above that level of complexity already, although it's not demonstrating that. And as a part of that, it's failing to take in a variety of alternative ways of thinking about higher levels of sophistication. Do you think it's fair to describe that as bullying, or is that deliberately exaggerated and provocative?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat bullying. I listened yesterday into a conversation of Sextine is to a meta-modernist with Thomas Mark. And what Sextine spoke about is the genocidal language that is growing in our cultures, that people, based on their ideology, start to use a language that directly implicates that certain people are not worth living. And I guess that's the same thing that happens within Hanzi's book. And not that I sometimes have moments as well where I deny other people's right to live. But there is obviously a grammar and a syntax and a meaning that implies that certain people have to be hurt and die. Like postmodernists, they have to be kicked in their ass. And I guess if you even only metaphorically of a perspective that implicates that people have to be hurt or eradicated, one is a bully. And I think then one might bully back or should at least tell them that they are doing something that seems to be even out of the ideal realm of their co-thinkers or co-enactors of the paradigm they seem to be part of. Even so, I'm not completely aware of all the connections within in their sort of paradigm they try to bring forth. In
my personal experiences of Daniel and Emil and Hanzi. I don't find them to be socially problematic, but I'm certainly aware of this versions of this problem you're talking about. One thing I see a great deal in our society is people who are supposedly using the content of higher progressive political things, but they're speaking them in a way that seems dangerously medieval at best. And there's an enormous need to, I think, separate this style from the content, because once a form of content has been established, almost anybody can use those words and seemingly use those concepts, no matter what level they're coming from. And if you use advanced concepts at a lower level, there's a danger that those concepts are now operating as if they were a primitive tool rather than a sophisticated tool. So that seems to be a real danger. But that brings my mind around to the question of politics, because Brent Cooper suggested that interrogating your politics would tell us more than interrogating your grammatical critique. So do you think that's valid? Do you think it's valid to assess someone in terms of the ideological allegiances in which they're embedded? And what would you say are your politics?
Yeah, first I had a nice conversation with Brent yesterday, not yesterday, the day before yesterday. And it was very harmonious. And I guess we recognized that we align in multiple ways in the way we want to have our world to change. And I really appreciated the conversation. And it was not at all difficult. I guess, yes, political ideals are difficult because, again, it's difficult to kind of decipher how they really differ. Like I had a conversation with my wife's father. So he was in the German parliament for some years, and he's a socialist. And then he tells me something about Marx, that Marx was 70 years. So can I bring in him? So now it's late. He says something Marx already said, that each flourishing country or something has to look at the community and then at the individual. And then I say, okay, yeah, that's a nice idea. But when you look at Adam Smith and you read not The Wealth of Nations, but the Moral Sentiments books, he writes about the impartial observer. How is the impartial observer defined? As being connected to the collective field of thoughts and ideals that are held by anyone, so that you permanently judge yourself in a way that your egoism works towards the benefit of everyone within the culture. So you have the word egoism and caring about yourself very dominantly within the work. At the same time, the collectivity is in there as some sort of idea of the good within the impartial observer. So the deep ideology or the dialectics between individual and collective is there as well, but it's just a little bit differently nuanced. And therefore, it's difficult for me to say that I'm on the one side or the other, but I cannot acknowledge that they both try to align in individual and collective in different ways. And then when we start off from there, seeing that there are communalities, we can better proceed together instead of creating some split between socialism and liberalism and all these things. And then it, of course, comes down to certain evolutionary trajectories. On the one hand, society evolves. But then when you see liberalism, it involves at the same time, like you have Kant with the idea of eternal peace, and we have to have free markets, and anyone has to have satisfied their economic needs so that peace can happen, which is an idea that arose from a very late stage, to informed by Adam Smith, who transcended the whole mercantilist thought that looking for your own gain, your own country's gain, will improve overall life. And so you offer free markets and all these things from very late stages. And then you introduced, like Theodor Wilke, the German thinker that Foucault mentions in The Birth of Biopolitics, who says we are all unique. Because we are all unique, we have to establish a rule of law. Because if we are all unique, we cannot really judge who's better or worse, but everyone has to be judged by the same forms of law, and everyone has to have the same abilities to use jurisdiction to sort of bring their uniqueness into the world. And below uniqueness and the rule of law, you have competition as the third, which is directed towards the concrete world to account for the differences that people have within themselves so that they can actualize themselves differently within the dream world and the material realm. And then you later on have people at a little bit earlier stages like Friedrich von Hayek, who still acknowledges first we have to have a society that generates certain laws and rules and principles and guidelines that everyone can commit to, so that competition moves forward in a way that's beneficial for everyone. And then, of course, you have taken away the sense of uniqueness, the sense of using your reason, being connected to a concept idea of Sittlichkeit or the moral imperative, and this kind of collective sense of taking in consideration everyone else, perfect role taking, and so on. And this then again becomes reduced towards things like anarcho-capitalism, where you have Murray Rothbard, for example, who says we have to destroy any form of capitalism because Watergate showed us that you cannot trust any politician. The only thing that we can trust is our liberty and our competition. And then you see that the whole complex idea from a very late stage, the free markets as a function of eternal peace and as a function of moving beyond state boundaries and becoming self-organizing and taking into account everyone's perspective so that make perfect decisions within the self-organizing system, becomes reduced to absolute individualism. And when you regress down all these layers and end up at an ideology, I guess any form of politics, whether socialist or liberalist, becomes very dangerous. But when we establish a trajectory that allows to become dialectical in between these points of views, they are not at all contradictory, because liberalism has the collective within the rule of law, or it has it within the impartial observer, while Marxism has the individual at the same time as someone who has been liberated from certain restrained by the egos of the company holders or whatever, the capitalists. And then you can easily dialectically align these things and let them grow forward into later stages. But asking at the level of ideology and any meaning of judging that is irrelevant to me, because it's ideology against ideology, and then, okay, we have the same ideology, but how can this change the world? We will create boundaries, we will create war, we will create fractures, we will enslave other people's consciousnesses into the way we think they have to be. We take away uniqueness, we take away laws, we take away Sittlichkeit and the ethical life. And therefore, I'm not sure if politics is the best way to judge. I guess it's more the capability of people, the soft skills they enact, which are largely entrained by stage, but not only, I guess, too, if you're someone who's ideological and is not only within their authentic self or their ideology, but can shift back and forth between seeing their ideals as empty, as illusions or arbitrary, and then back into ideology, then I guess people might enact it in a way that's serviceable even for the development into later forms of society. But if a person is not unable to do this, then ideology or political things are meaningless for me.
The relationship of the more complex person or groups to overall benevolent social progress is very debated. Some people obviously feel very much that unless you can be more sophisticated, let's say, than the social regime in which you live, then there's no real opportunity. There's no openings for you to try to help move that system forward. But other people would argue that the very idea of complexity and sophistication somehow serves the particular type of society that we're in now, and that form of logic itself can never really help us because it's enslaved to the incentive structure of the world we currently exist in. Do you have a feeling about the relationship between those two interpretations?
Okay, can you repeat the first one?
The first one is that if we wanted to make progress, we would have to have people become more complex, deeper, more sophisticated than the current system that we live in, so that they could find ways and tools and methods to open new spaces for us. But the counter argument is that that whole form of thinking is very modern, very capitalistic, already enslaved to the world we're in, and can't get us out of it.
The idea that even if you transcend a stage, you still are that much infiltrated or corrupted by the system, that you even if you transcend it, you can only reflect it through the terms of the current system.
I think it's a mixture of you're already corrupted and it comes through the terms, but also the idea that wanting to approach it that way, wanting to be more developed is also part of that same structure.
Wanting to be developed is part of the capitalist structure, a kind of human capital thing that you have to grow to be more worthy within the economic context to serve better your own personal gain and so on. And I guess when we relate back to Adam Smith, or the idea of the good, what comes through the good is some sort of collective ideal. Of course, it's the discourse that's filtered through your own kind of whatever vision and listening and brain structure. And then if one looks at it evolutionary, it will come down from the later stage and show up as being conditioned towards enacting yourself in a way that's appropriate towards the cultural context. And I think that's important. If anyone would not, to a degree, condition, nothing would work. So there have to be some sort of mechanisms that automate these things. But I guess we have many other mechanisms as well. If a society becomes interested to a degree that certain people are prohibited from satisfying their needs, the amygdala cooks up anger and all these things, which can be a destructive force towards societal structures, as much as the destabilization of yourself and the growth into a later stage necessarily seems to incorporate a mechanism of negation, which means you have to in some way come up with an opposing idea towards the idea which incorporated or was embodied within your previous consciousness. And I guess whatever the reason is, when you look at Piaget, you have the identity, then you have the negation, then you have the reciprocation between both, or the integration, and then you bring up a new whole, which is a new stage, which means that biology, I guess, or development itself smarts out the idea that we cannot grow out of a certain society because it necessitates that we negate and that we come up with different ideas, which of course are then nurtured by a different type of culture that has to exist at this place and time, because where from else you should get ideas and thoughts and recombine them. But then too, you have, when one uses Whitehead, the sort of creative principle within it, the recombination, or Schumpeter's creative destruction, and you have quantum leaps and sort of potentials within your brain that interrupt habitual thought patterns and make them create something very new that's kind of accidental. And the whole brain is based on being very fuzzy and making mistakes and changing all over each day. And so I guess if we think of evolution, then you cannot assume that just because there is a state of the art or state of things won't change, because then there would never have happened a Big Bang or something like that. There has to be some kind of uncertainty principle, negation principle, and at the same time a synthesizing principle and structuring principle behind everything, within everything. And that's, of course, part of the argument why to criticize people who put people at different stages, because there seems to be something that's more universal than something else. And given that one can make a normative judgment, or at least observe from one's being one with whatever Brahman, Atman, larger sense of self that is within everything, to judge how the different universal layers within yourself and within society really cohere with what is coming forth from the invisible, indiscernible, and ground of being or consciousness, and then look how these align. Of course, one might err, but that's at least some sort of justification to do these things and keep things as much as possible aligned with the universals. And part of it is negation.
No, I appreciate that. And, one of the things that that comes up a number of times in your article is sort of this sense that Hanzi, and maybe not just Hanzi, insufficiently appreciates the great postmodernists like Foucault. And I'm curious about what's your overall sense of Foucault? Obviously, at his height, especially the later Foucault, there's some fantastic ideas in there that are really seem to open up new possibilities for us. And yet there's also a lot of critique of Foucault and very much focused around his politics and his ethics and things like that. What's your sense of him as a thinker and also as a human being?
I don't know very much about him as a human being. And I haven't read every book. To the end, but I tried to at least move through his history. And yeah, for me, it's inspiring. I would say, like, I was a much more linear thinker before I started to read his books. But it correlates with reading Luhmann, and Luhmann is some sort of post-structuralist as well, who is really doing some sort of discourse analysis and look how ideas unfold over long spans of time. And I think that was the very inspiring thing about Foucault, to say that you don't look only at the human, which was previously much more important for me. I was very interoceptive and very psychological in a sense. And through reading him, I recognized that I could really look at large spans of history and compare different books from different authors, or even write a history of one author and compare their books, which basically helped me to develop my assessment method. Because if I haven't looked very archaeological at how people wrote in succeeding periods of their life, or I couldn't have come up with a coherent measure of development, I would say. And even so, this is contrary to Foucault, who says that we should not put stages at the end of each rupture. I think it's basically coming from him, having been inspired to look at development in this sort of way, from the author's real life, to investigate how a stage was really expressed through an author, and compare how it is expressed through different authors, and then come up with a most positive, objective interpretation of what a stage could look like for a certain person or other persons, which is a completely different approach than only looking at sentence completion tests or anything else. And I think, yeah, even for Hanzi, if you want to listen, you have to have people who speak truth. So I'm not completely truly deep into Hanzi's work, so I cannot say how this thing is defined for him. But if you don't have someone who is practicing paresia, like Foucault says, you have nothing to listen to. And therefore people should be inspired by these ideas of speaking one's truth, even in the face of fear and being frightened. So even for me, this act of posting this article went along with a whole lot of fear. So I don't know what's coming up. I'm not sure which things I will be confronted with. I'm criticizing someone who is well accepted by all integral folks. So I'm not criticizing someone who is unimportant. And these are things where I, for myself, discovered that I can be truthful, and that it's a valuable part of being within a society and facing my fears. And I guess it, within the last half year or so, when I read him, it brought me a little bit back into being and speaking my truth. Yeah, and many other things I would say that he can offer.
So when you read, thinking about the level of sophistication of understanding that's expressed in the sentences of, say, Foucault and the great postmodernists, and the inner feeling that you get from those kinds of articulations, and then looking at Hanzi and saying, this is not giving me the feeling, and I'm not seeing the sentence structures that I would expect to see if this was a level beyond postmodern thought. I'm curious where you do see signs of something going even beyond the great postmodernists, where you get that feeling that, oh, this is working. Is it just in, classical mystical texts, or are there particular philosophers you think, oh, this really does go a step beyond structurally and give me the feeling that it does that?
Present day, I'm not really aware of. I guess in Germany you have Hartmut Rosa. I guess his books are translated, and he at least reaches for me some similar altitude, and two offers some very similar, not similar ideas, but ideas that resonate very well with what Habermas offered with this discourse, ethics, and Foucault with Parisia. But he offers resonance, and resonance again is built up on three different types of principles: vertical, horizontal, and diogeneal resonance, where you again have some sort of social technique that can enrich the way we are in this together. And really, within the philosophical realm, I'm not so much aware of what's going on in present day. And I think Wilber, for me, of course, even so, many of the points that would show up as true for Hanzi are true for Wilber as well. However, he reflects from, at least from my perspective, from a later stage, but makes the same mistakes like putting Derrida and Foucault and all these similar thinkers at a certain stage, like Green, as much as he puts Descartes and Newton and many thinkers at very different structure stages at the same stage. So there are some problems. And I would think Terry O'Fallon for me seems someone who is really going beyond modernists and postmodernists. Even so, I have my problems with her. But I guess it's legitimate to say that she's bringing forth something that's very profound, at least for me. And then one can go to 3 Hour Window, but it's of course historical, it's not present day society. And but when it of course comes to the ideas and not only to development, it's much more difficult to judge. So there might obviously be ideas within Hanzi's work that are very well fitted towards present day problems, which haven't been presented to thinkers that lived 1,000 years ago, and even to thinkers that lived 20 years ago.
The problem of not being able to see the levels that are above us is very interesting, right? Like it's possible that there's things in Hanzi that he's saying that you can't see. You're making an argument that Hanzi's not just bullying some thinkers, but he's incorrectly bullying, because he's bullying about things he hasn't even seen. Right. And you mentioned Wilber. Wilber has an interesting argument that, like, even in politics, the sort of liberal modern politics thinks it has a complaint about pluralist progressive politics, but it might not even see what that really is. It might just assume that's some version of itself or some lower level it's already familiar with. So how do we deal with the possibility that we do have to try to at least nominally get to grips with things that we haven't seen and experienced yet, but we don't want to fall into this trap of assuming that we can talk about those things from the level we're already at? That seems very tricky.
I think it's I'm not sure how one really can do it. So one cannot see what one cannot see, and that's basically what. Let's go back to Plato. So I don't know. I'm not sure what you really said. As far as I remember, I don't know everything, but at least I know what I don't know, or something like that. So the ability to discern where one is an expert and where one has invested time in is a good starting point, even if that's not necessarily the final point. But speaking about things where you haven't invested in a certain amount of time and learning, it is something where one most probably is not very knowledgeable about, and will, if the thing is a complex object like stage development, one will most probably fail to describe it appropriately. And then, yeah, how does one get enabled to see what one does not see?
What level of sophistication? What level do you have to be at in order to be able to know what you don't know?
Yeah, I guess. Has it to do something necessary with development, that one can recognize certain things that one does not know? Maybe a bit, but I guess at least when you develop some self-reflexive capacity, or when one, so I'm not sure where really, at least in books written from the stage where I have sorted Hanzi in, if it's a right assessment, like the Chinese Sun Tzu. He writes about knowing what one knows, and knowing what one doesn't know is a part of wisdom. So at least there, I guess even if you move later into the past, if you read ancient myths, texts and proverbs from the Egyptians or in the Old Testament, there are two kind of mart or wisdom defined as listening, include sentences to speak not about things where you're not knowledgeable, but it's wiser to be silent instead of speaking if you're not connected with smart or wisdom and knowledgeability in a domain. So I guess one can very early learn to discern these things, where one is an expert or where one is not. The more difficult thing then, of course, is if you are an expert and if you have invested 10 years or 20 years in a model, to then see that you somehow misconstructed reality. And that's, at least for me, the interesting part, where I could speak from a more self-reflexive stance. So what's happening for me, if I'm not certain about things, but I speak them out, and I'm nevertheless willing to make a mistake within my uncertainty, there will happen some sort of kind of feedback loop because I externalize things. I become doubtful and critical about whatever I offered. I decenter from myself. I see it as something external, and then I can much more engage into the idea that I'm wrong, and start to see how things could be different. And therefore, I guess it has something to do with courage to recognize what one knows and what one does not know, and in investing time, testing oneself, being skeptical, but nevertheless sticking with the sense of truth one has. So I read Descartes yesterday a little bit, and it's one of his principles. Even if I start to doubt my own truth and the hypothesis I put forward, I continue to engage in it to the point where I'm really certain about it being wrong or it being right. So I guess one does not should not move away from one's truth too fast, but kind of challenge it and investigate in it and test it against reality all the time. And then I guess Hegel quote, each beginning is incomplete and imperfect. And even exactly the incompletion and imperfection and negation that happens is truth that is coming to itself through erring and making mistakes. Again, yeah. So I guess that's important to be willing. But if you have these types of truths, and if you have to engage in these types of processes, then it's of course again difficult to not force a book when you're certain about something. And then you have to have some collective mechanisms of expertise that engage in judging whatever you do. And therefore, I think it's especially part of science, or basically as part of any system. There should be some sort of third order observation, or certain second order observers who make up opinion or hypotheses about reality, about what we see, move into discourse and compare their works, and do not hesitate to criticize others if they think they have found some sort of truth that is contradicting what other people put forth, which again, courage and parrhesia, truth-telling, moving in resonance even with the things that you cannot predict how they turn out. And there, Hartmut Rosa too tells that if you want to have resonance with the world, if you want to just discover some sort of meaning and subjective truth within reality, or even objective truth, you have to be uncertain about whatever will come out at the end. I guess so. It's some diffuse text I now talked about, but it's a little bit diffuse maybe. So yeah.
Good. There was one other thing that interested me when I was reading your responses to people's responses to your article, and that was, this came up a number of times, involution and descent, and the role that involution and descending might play in meaning making and culture. What do you think of when you think of the relationship between culture and meaning and involutionary descent?
Yeah, I guess I pointed several times now to it. I think, yeah, involution, descent, recognizing that my mind does no longer work as properly. But I think, yeah, descent, it's important. And I think if you look at Foucault, for example, at his texts, he descends and evolves simultaneously very well, because he takes an ancient text that might be below his center of gravity, and he still reasons within their structures. So he's comparing them, he's putting forth arguments that are at the same level of complexity as things he's taking in. At the same time, he's translating everything, he's thinking about it towards a later stage. And I think it's important to have both movements in there, that you descend towards earlier stages and then you ascend again. And of course, that's necessary, because if you want to compare two things, you have to have in mind two simpler things that you can compare. So the whole idea of writing something like something about stages of consciousness means that you have to be able to descend towards the stage A you want to compare, and ascend to stage B that you want to compare, or descend to stage B that you want to compare. Stage B should be earlier than stage A, and then compare it. So the whole thing does not work without ascending and descending. And from my point of view, simultaneously, when you move through a stage or a layer of development, you always connect back to earlier layers. Because if you enact your firstness within the mental sphere, your witnessing self within your heart, it's a sort of sensual self. Like Wilber says that, I guess is it Illumined Mind, or in Aurobinos' work, is again a cross state. It's a sensory stage that incorporates a sensory state, where sensory and state and sensory stage come together. And in the same sense, I would say that each tier moves through firstness, secondness, thirdness, and so on, through the four functions, and then realigns with earlier layers. Your heart connects back to your sensory realm, and you reintegrate whatever is happening there. And so it's a natural descent and a natural ascent, as much as Kant would say that ideas without objects in reality are blind, or something like that, and perceptions without ears behind it are some way meaningless. And there you always have this sort of idea that you have to ascend and descend. And I guess there are only some very extremist positions that do not acknowledge that you ascend and descend, even if you are more on the side of being an ascender or a descender, which are kind of emptiness parts, where you transcend and exclude every stage on the path that you have moved through, and then rest in in some perfect blissful state that is detached from everything. But everyone else who thinks about reality or creates a thought will always incorporate earlier stages in descent or ascent. Like if you have a triadic sentence, each triadic sentence will have the mind, it will have the dream self within your belly, within whatever, and will have your sensory self incorporated, because it has these three positions, and these three positions have to be filled. So it's easier. It's either including in ascending fashion senses, dreams, and mind, or it is doing vice versa, from mind to dream to senses. And so it's quite naturally. Things just build up naturally along the developmental trajectory. That's the whole idea, where you cannot voice your thought if you have not completely integrated your sensory realm. If you have not integrated your inner child, you cannot speak. And when you speak, you descend naturally in towards your sensory realm and become one with the word you voice. So it's a kind of permanent interplay. And if I say something like interplay, I have to envision something. I have to dream up something, playing with something else. And so I'm including my secondness or dreaming self and descend towards that. And then I make up an opinion within my mind. And so it's just naturally to move up and down the staircase. And I guess both sides have their benefits. Both sides have their difficulties. But there, one can read Wilber. Wilber's sexicology, spirituality.
This is great. I think we're probably pretty much at the end. I like getting to see your perspective more. I appreciate the care you seem to be bringing towards not over hastily leaving things behind and dismissing them, whether it's lower things like sensory reality or whether it's philosophers people think they've already moved beyond. So there's a real care there that I see about not over hastily thinking we've gone beyond something and don't need to appreciate it anymore. And I also admire your courage in trying to be sincere with your own responses and your own thinking, and to just see where that goes. And I think that's something all higher thought communities need people to be working on and taking seriously. So thank you, Roman.
Thanks to Layman for the care thing. Really nice verbalization of whatever is going on within me. And seeing not this anger, but this care.